Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Rachel White and I'm a Senior Lecturer in Ecology and Conservation Science here at the University of Brighton. Now for this taster lecture, I'd like to explore with you all the important topic of extinction and species endangerment, placed within the broader context of conservation science. Now, defining the term extinct is relatively straightforward. It's when there are no living members left of a given species or taxa. And in fact, some 99.9% of all species that have ever existed are now extinct. So the vast majority of extinctions have occurred naturally prior to humans walking on Earth, and they will continue once humans ultimately go extinct. So why are there any species left at all then? Well, extinctions are offset by speciation. These are both fundamental evolutionary processes. And throughout the majority of time that there's been life on Earth, there's been a pretty constant background rate of extinction. So on average, a few species go extinct and a few species arise every million years per lineage. However, occasionally, this is interrupted by what we call mass extinction events. And there have been a total of 5 such events recorded in the Earth's fossil record. So the most famous of these is the KT mass extinction event, 65 million years ago at the boundary between the Cretaceous and Tertiary periods. 75% of all species became extinct, including the dinosaurs. Consequently, mammals and birds radiated and emerged as being dominant land vertebrates after the event. However, the biggest mass extinction event occurred some 248 million years ago at the boundary between the Permian and Triassic periods. So this PT mass extinction event, also called the Great Dying, killed about 96% of all marine species and an estimated 70% of land species. Now, these mass extinction events were all caused by a combination of natural drivers, so extraterrestrial impact, supercontinent formation, massive volcanic activity. But the very big question that we currently face is, are we currently at the beginning edge of a 6th mass extinction event? Well, the scientific evidence strongly suggests that we are, with the primary driver and causal factor being us, humans. So we currently see extinction rates up to 1,000 times higher than the background rates, depending on the taxonomic group. And not only is the primary driver of population declines and extinction that we're currently experiencing different to previous mass extinction events, but so is the speed. Currently, rates are much quicker. Now, back in 2010, an important study was published which mapped the anthropogenic or human transformation of the terrestrial world from between 1700 to 2000. Now, the main finding was that between these two time periods, the terrestrial biosphere made the critical transition from being mostly wild to mostly anthropogenic. You can see the shift in colour. Now, this transition is better emphasised spatially in a map. So here we have the land type distribution for 1700, and we can see that the vast proportion of land is wild, or at least semi-natural. So keep this in your mind, because here we have the map for 2000, and you can see that there's been a drastic shift towards rangelands, croplands, villages, dense settlements, highly anthropogenic environments. So based on our impact or footprint on the planet, there's a call by a number of scientists for us to formalise a new geological time period or epoch called the Anthropocene. So this is viewed as a period during which human activity is the dominant influence of climate and the wider environment. So this proposed Anthropocene follows on from the relatively stable Holocene and starts from the mid-20th century. So from the mid-20th century, the 1950s onwards, we noticeably entered a more unstable and rapidly evolving phase of our planet's history. So here we can see how various socio-economic measures increase exponentially from the 1950s onwards. And here we have the same for Earth system measures such as carbon dioxide and biodiversity loss. And in terms of the specific external drivers causing current declines in extinction and wildlife, listed here at the bottom, they essentially all stem back to the cumulative impacts of 7.8 billion people, many of whom currently live beyond their means unsustainably. And it was this realisation that ultimately led to the emergence of conservation biology in the late 1970s. So this is a field focused on understanding, protecting and perpetuating biological diversity at all levels and scales, and it's an inherently multi and interdisciplinary scientific subject. And there are a number of tools in the conservation scientist's toolbox, one of the fundamental ones being the Red List. This is founded and maintained by the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and it's used to objectively assess the extinction risk status of the world's species. This is based on their population and range sizes and their trends. So assessed species are placed into one of 8 categories listed here, and it's a very useful tool for prioritising conservation efforts. Currently, more than 26,000 species are formally recognised as being threatened, so that's vulnerable, endangered or critically endangered. However, the vast majority of known species are classified either as not evaluated or data deficient. So only well-studied groups such as birds, mammals, amphibians have been fully assessed. And extinction risk is being evaluated for less than 5% of the world's described species. And sometimes there's the potential for what's called Romeo's error, which is wrongly declaring a species to be extinct when in actual fact it still exists. This is more common than you might think because very rarely are extinctions physically observed, so we instead have to think about extinctions in terms of probability. Now this can lead to rediscoveries, and these rediscovered species are collectively called Lazarus taxa, and we have just some examples here. So starting from the left and going top left and going clockwise, we have the Cuban Selenodon, it's a venomous mammal species, Banggai crow from Indonesia, pteroskink from New Caledonia, jellyfish tree from the Seychelles, black Cockney salmon from Japan, painted frog from Colombia, and the Lord Howe's stick insect. These examples are all taxonomically diverse, but one thing that they all have in common is that they are all threatened. They all have small ranges and or population sizes. Now, of course, there are some species which we are confident that they have been driven to extinction as a result of humans. So here we just have a montage of some of these. The passenger pigeon, top left, was the most abundant bird in the USA and possibly the world. It went from billions to 0 in a matter of only a few years, largely due to overhunting. Nobody at the time thought that such a species could go extinct. There are anecdotes about flocks being 1 mile wide and 300 miles long, taking 14 hours to pass and holding probably in excess of 3.5 billion birds. It was simply not conceivable that a bird like this or a species like this could be driven to extinction. And now I wonder how many people have heard of this species. This is the bramble K melamis. Well, actually, I hadn't until it hit the news back in 2016, when it was declared extinct due to habitat loss from rising sea levels. But the vast majority of the planet has never even heard of it. And then there are the millions of species out there that are yet to be discovered. It's hard to care and conserve for a species if we don't know it exists. However, there are a vast array of conservation techniques employed to conserve biodiversity, and one of the roles of conservation science is to assess how successful they are and to recommend adaptations when needed. So this is the foundation of evidence-based conservation. But one of the more recent and radical conservation approaches is that of de-extinction. Now, crudely put, this is bringing species back from the dead. And it might sound like science fiction, but it's received a lot of scientific and media attention in recent years. So techniques can be used such as backbreeding, using artificial selection, which has been applied in the case of the urk, this is a wild cattle species that went extinct in the 1600s, or where most attention is now being focused on, which is cloning and genetic material synthesis. So there are a number of proposed candidate species. These are just a selection. Of course, there are a lot of factors to take into account, but suitable surrogates has been found to try and bring back the passenger pigeon. For example, the woolly mammoth genome has been completely sequenced. So advancements are being made in this area, but many challenges lay ahead. not least the significant ethical debate surrounding it, which is a topic I discuss with my students. And I'm in the band of scientists that think that it's not the answer for conservation. It's a side story, potentially of value to a small handful of species. Instead, I think we should be focusing on those which are still alive but under threat. And given the funding and resource support, we're actually good at saving species from the brink of extinction. So here are just a few success stories from the UK alone. And part of the growing conservation optimism movement focuses on celebrating and learning from these success stories, which is really important. Now ultimately, why should we care and worry about ongoing biodiversity declines and extinction? Well, it's a multifaceted topic, but simply put, human existence depends upon nature. What are collectively called ecosystem services, some of which are shown in this figure here. So medicine, food, water, pollination, recreation, cultural services, mental health and well-being. And attempts to put a value on nature come out with estimates that go well into the trillions, so much higher than the world's total global GDP, and in all likelihood a gross underestimate. Now, everything I've touched upon during this taster session will be explored in much more detail during some of the modules offered here at Brighton. And I've packaged some of these key topics into questions that conservation biologists, scientists research. It's not an exhaustive list. And in particular, but not exclusively, these topics fall under part of the ecology and conservation theme which I lead, which runs all the way from the first year to the final year. And if you have any questions at all, please do get in touch with me via email. I'll be more than happy to speak with you and to answer your questions.